The icy wind howled through the dark alleyway, slicing through the tattered coat wrapped around her trembling body. She pulled it tighter, huddling against the cold brick wall, hoping the night would pass quickly. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, but she was used to it. She had nothing. No home. No family. No future. The sound of tires screeching against wet pavement made her flinch. A sleek black car stopped just a few feet away, its headlights cutting through the darkness like two glowing eyes. Her muscles tensed as the door slowly swung open. A man stepped out. Tall. Composed. Dressed in a coat that looked more expensive than anything she had ever owned. He was clean-shaven, his sharp eyes scanning her with an expression that sent chills down her spine. He didn't belong here, not in this part of the city, not on a night like this. She instinctively shrank back as he took a step forward. "You," he said, his voice deep and controlled. "Come here." Every instinct screamed at her to run. She had learned the hard way that nothing good ever came from a stranger's attention, especially one with money. But something about him was different. He wasn't leering, wasn't mocking her like others did. His tone carried no pity, only purpose. Her frozen fingers gripped the fabric of her coat as she forced herself to speak. "What do you want?" His answer was swift, direct. "I have a proposal for you." A cold knot formed in her stomach. "I don't do that," she snapped, turning her face away, ashamed. The man's expression remained unreadable. "It's not what you think." She hesitated. Something about his voice, it was as if he had already decided she would listen. Against her better judgment, she did. "If you agree to have my child," he said, "I will give you enough money to change your life forever." The air around them seemed to freeze. She blinked, sure she had misheard. "What?" "I need an heir." His voice was smooth, controlled, like he had rehearsed this conversation many times. "I don't want a wife. I don't want attachments. Just an agreement." Her mind reeled. This was insane. A joke, maybe? But there was no humor in his eyes. Why me?" Her voice came out hoarse, barely above a whisper. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he studied her, his gaze calculating, almost clinical. "Because you have something I need." The words sent a strange shiver down her spine. Everything in her told her to refuse, to walk away. But she had nothing. No hope. No way out. And now, standing before her, was a man offering her more money than she could ever dream of, just for bringing a child into the world. Her lips parted, her breath unsteady. A single choice could change everything. But at what cost? The car glided through the city streets, its engine purring like a caged beast. She sat stiffly in the plush leather seat, her hands gripping the fabric of her worn coat. The weight of her decision pressed against her chest, heavier than anything she had ever carried. She had said yes. But she still didn't understand why. The man beside her, silent, unreadable, had barely spoken since she entered the car. He hadn't given her his name, nor had he asked for hers. He simply told her to come, and she had obeyed. Now, she was heading toward an unknown future with a stranger who had offered her everything. The city lights blurred past, and soon, the streets became quieter, the buildings taller. The car slowed in front of an iron gate, which opened without hesitation, as if the world itself bent to this man's will. Beyond it, a massive estate loomed in the darkness. The house was more like a fortress, grand, cold, unwelcoming. The driver stopped in front of the entrance. Without a word, the man stepped out. She hesitated before following. The air smelled different here, clean, expensive, untouched by the struggle of the world she had known. A butler opened the door, his expression unreadable. "Prepare a room," the man ordered, not sparing a glance her way. She followed him inside, her breath catching at the sheer size of the space. Marble floors gleamed under the dim chandelier lights. The silence in the house was unnatural, like no one truly lived here. She turned to him. "I don't even know your name." He finally met her gaze. "You don't need to." Something inside her tightened. "If I'm supposed to have your child, I think I do." His jaw clenched slightly, but he didn't argue. Instead, he spoke with precision, each word measured. "There are rules." She crossed her arms, suddenly aware of how small she felt in this house. "Rules? You will stay here for the duration of your pregnancy," he stated, as if it were already decided. "You will have everything you need. Clothes, food, medical care." She swallowed, waiting for the catch. "There will be no personal questions," he continued, his voice emotionless. "No interference in my life. You follow every medical protocol exactly as instructed." His tone was firm, but there was something beneath it, something careful. As if he was more concerned about her health than he should be. "And if I don't?" she asked, lifting her chin. He stared at her for a long moment. "Then the deal is off." She flinched at the finality in his voice. This wasn't just a business arrangement to him. There was something more. "What happens after?" she dared to ask. His expression didn't change. "Once the child is born, you'll receive your payment and be free to go." Free. The word felt strange. She should feel relieved, this was what she had agreed to. And yet, a feeling of unease crept up her spine. Who was he? Why did he want this child so desperately? And why, despite everything, did he seem afraid? The days passed in a blur of silence and unanswered questions. She had been given a room that was bigger than any apartment she had ever lived in, more space than she knew what to do with. The bed was soft, the air smelled like fresh linen, and the closet was filled with clothes in her size. Everything she needed was provided without question. But the house itself felt wrong. It was too quiet. Too controlled. Too much like a place built to keep secrets rather than a home. She had tried to explore on the first day, wandering down the long, cold hallways. But every door was locked. Every room, except the ones she was allowed to use, was off limits. And the staff, though polite, avoided her. The only person who spoke to her was the doctor who visited every morning. A different doctor than she expected. Not just an ordinary physician, but a specialist, one who took her blood, ran tests, and noted every little detail about her pregnancy as if it were some kind of experiment. She had asked why so many tests were necessary. The doctor only smiled. Routine monitoring. But nothing about this was routine. The man, the millionaire, remained distant, yet strangely watchful. He never asked about her. Never showed personal interest in her well-being. But when the doctor spoke, he listened carefully, as if every word mattered. She wasn't stupid. Something was going on. And it had everything to do with the child growing inside her. One night, she couldn't sleep. The house was too still, the air thick with the weight of something unspoken. She got up, moving carefully across the polished floors, pressing her ear against the door. Outside, the sound of voices drifted from down the hall. Men talking. She quietly opened the door just enough to hear. "She's progressing faster than expected." The doctor's voice. "It's too early to tell," another man said. "But if the genetic markers hold, this could be the breakthrough we need." Silence. Then the millionaire spoke. His voice was low, unreadable. "And if they don't?" A pause. "We'll deal with it when the time comes." She sucked in a sharp breath, stepping back, her heart pounding against her ribs. Deal with it? What did that mean? Something was wrong. This wasn't just about an heir. This was about the child. And now, she was certain, whatever she had agreed to, whatever she had signed up for, was far more dangerous than she ever could have imagined. She couldn't pretend anymore. Something was terribly wrong. The house, the doctors, the rules, none of it felt normal. And after what she overheard last night, she knew one thing for sure: she wasn't just carrying a child. She was part of something much bigger. And she needed answers. The next morning, she refused to let the doctor touch her. "I want to know what's going on," she demanded, backing away from the examination chair. The doctor sighed, glancing toward the door, as if expecting someone to intervene. "You don't need to worry about, I'm not asking." Her voice was sharper this time. "Tell me the truth, or I walk." The doctor hesitated for a long moment, then shook his head. "You should speak to him." Him. The millionaire. She clenched her fists, feeling her pulse throb against her temples. Fine. She found him in his office, always working, always lost in whatever consumed his thoughts. He barely looked up when she entered. "I want answers." Her voice was steady, despite the fear clawing at her insides. He sighed, finally setting his pen down. "This is not a conversation we need to have." She laughed dryly. "Not a conversation we need to have? I'm carrying your child, and I just overheard people talking about dealing with it if something goes wrong. So yeah, I think we need to have this conversation." A flicker of something crossed his face. Something dangerously close to fear. Then, for the first time since she met him, his cold exterior cracked. He stood, pacing toward the massive window overlooking the estate. "Every male in my bloodline has suffered from a rare genetic defect," he admitted, his voice quieter now. "A disorder that deteriorates the mind and body. It doesn't show until adulthood. And once it does, there's no cure." She swallowed hard, trying to process his words. "But you think, this baby won't have it?" He turned back to her, his gaze intense. "I don't think. I know." "How?" He hesitated. "Because of you." A chill ran through her. "What do you mean?" "You were chosen." His voice was unreadable now, like he was carefully selecting each word. "Your genetic markers. Your health. The tests we ran before this agreement was made, everything pointed to you being the answer." She took a shaky step back. "You tested me," she whispered. "We had to be sure." Her stomach churned. This wasn't about a child. This was about an experiment. A gamble. A desperate attempt to manipulate fate. But he still wasn't telling her everything. Because if this was just about genetics, then why was he afraid of the birth? There was something else. Something much bigger. And she was about to find out what it was. The contractions came faster than expected. One moment, she was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with everything she had learned. The next, a sharp pain ripped through her abdomen, forcing a strangled gasp from her lips. Something was wrong. This wasn't normal labor. The pain was too sudden. Too intense. She barely had time to call for help before the door burst open. The doctors were already waiting. Almost as if they knew this was coming. The world around her blurred. Bright lights. Cold instruments. The sterile scent of antiseptic. She could barely focus as they rushed her onto a hospital bed inside the mansion, an entire medical wing prepared just for this moment. She tried to fight the fog clouding her mind, but everything felt heavy. The pain dulled, her limbs weak. They had given her something. She turned her head, her vision swimming. And then she saw him. The millionaire stood in the corner of the room, his face pale, his hands clenched into fists. He wasn't watching her. He was watching the doctors. No, watching them prepare for the baby. Why did he look so afraid? The pressure built, her body trembling, the weight of something far greater than pain bearing down on her. She couldn't think, couldn't breathe, and then she heard it. A single, piercing cry. The room went silent. Not the kind of silence that followed a healthy birth. Not the kind of silence filled with relief. This was different. Something was wrong. She forced herself to lift her head, ignoring the dizziness threatening to pull her under. The doctors, who had moved with such confidence, were frozen in place. Their faces pale. Their hands trembling. She turned, her gaze landing on the tiny bundle in the doctor's arms. And then she saw it. Her breath caught in her throat. The baby. Something was different. Something was impossible. She tried to speak, but before she could, the doctors moved, whispering to each other, shielding the newborn from view as they rushed toward the other end of the room. She struggled against the weakness in her body. Wait, what's happening? No one answered. And then she looked at him. The millionaire. His eyes were locked on the child. His entire body was tense, his expression unreadable, but beneath it all, there was something else. Shock. Terror. Like he had expected something unusual, but not this. She fought to keep her consciousness, but the drugs in her system pulled her under. The last thing she saw before darkness swallowed her was his face, his cold, controlled mask shattered for the first time. And for the first time since she had met him. He looked afraid. She woke to the sound of hushed whispers. Her body felt heavy, her limbs sluggish, but the fog in her mind was lifting. The memories of what happened rushed back in an instant, the pain, the silence, the looks of horror on the doctors' faces. The baby. Something was wrong with the baby. She forced her eyes open. The dim glow of the bedside lamp cast long shadows across the room. She was no longer in the medical wing but back in her bedroom. Yet something felt off. Footsteps. She turned her head toward the doorway, her heart pounding as she saw him. The millionaire stood just outside, speaking in hushed tones with one of the doctors. She cannot know yet, he was saying. His voice, always composed, carried an edge of unease. She's the mother, the doctor responded. She has a right to, I said not yet. His tone left no room for argument. Her pulse quickened. They were keeping something from her. She sat up, the movement sending a sharp ache through her body, but she didn't care. Where is my baby? The voices stopped. The doctor turned toward her, startled. The millionaire's expression hardened. She swung her legs over the bed, gripping the blanket to steady herself. Tell me what's going on. Silence. Then, the doctor sighed, running a hand over his face. You should see for yourself. They led her back to the medical wing. Her steps were slow, every muscle in her body protesting, but she didn't stop. The millionaire walked beside her, silent, his jaw tense. Finally, they reached a room at the end of the hall. The doctor opened the door. And she saw her child. A small bassinet sat in the center of the room, surrounded by machines she didn't recognize. But she barely noticed them. All she could see was him. Her baby. Tiny, delicate, perfect. But there was something else. Something unnatural. Her breath caught in her throat. The child's eyes were open. Newborns weren't supposed to do that, not like this. Not with such awareness. His gaze locked onto hers instantly, unblinking, filled with something no infant should possess. Understanding. Recognition. As if he knew exactly who she was. And then, as she took a shaky step forward, the impossible happened. The lights in the room flickered. The machines beeped erratically. And for a brief moment, the air itself seemed to shift. She gasped, stumbling backward. The baby hadn't moved. He hadn't made a sound. But something had happened. She turned to the millionaire, her voice shaking. What is he? He didn't answer immediately. Then, with a slow breath, he finally admitted, something I never expected. Her hands trembled. You said you planned for everything. I did. His gaze remained fixed on the child. But not this. She looked back at the baby, her heart pounding in her chest. He wasn't just healthy. He was something more. Something no one could have predicted. And now, she wasn't just the mother of an heir. She was the mother of something the world had never seen before. The air in the room felt different now, heavy, charged with something she couldn't name. She couldn't take her eyes off the baby. He lay perfectly still in the bassinet, his tiny chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. His gaze, however, remained locked onto hers, as if he knew she was watching. No, not just watching. Trying to understand. Something deep inside her, an instinct older than reason, whispered, "This is not normal." She took another cautious step forward. The moment she did, the lights flickered again. The machines beeped wildly. She froze. The baby blinked. And the room fell silent. The lights steadied. The machines hummed as if nothing had happened. She turned sharply toward the millionaire. Tell me what's going on. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides. His carefully controlled mask had cracked, just enough for her to see what lay beneath. Not just surprise. Not just fear. Uncertainty. The man who had planned for everything was facing something even he couldn't explain. I don't know, he admitted finally. A shiver ran down her spine. He had manipulated, calculated, and controlled every step of this process, yet, here he was, admitting the truth. She looked back at the baby. She had seen newborns before. They were fragile, barely able to focus their eyes. But this child was different. Too aware. Too still. Too powerful. The doctor, standing in the corner, cleared his throat. We've been running tests. She whipped around. What kind of tests? The doctor hesitated before answering. The child's vitals are stable, but there are anomalies. He exchanged a look with the millionaire before continuing. He has a higher than normal body temperature. Unusually strong neural activity. And, he hesitated again. And what? She demanded. The doctor swallowed. He responds to emotions. Specifically, yours. Her breath hitched. She turned back to the baby. It wasn't just the lights flickering. It wasn't just the machines reacting. It was her. Every time she felt fear, the room changed. Every time she stepped closer, the child knew. The truth slammed into her like a crashing wave. He wasn't just different. He wasn't just healthy. He was connected to her. She stumbled back. The air felt too thick, her thoughts too fast. What does this mean? The millionaire exhaled slowly. It means we don't just have an heir. His voice was low, almost reverent. We have something the world has never seen before. She could barely process what was happening. Her child, their child, was not just different. He was something beyond human understanding. The flickering lights, the erratic machines, the way he sensed her emotions, it all pointed to something far more terrifying. And yet, the millionaire stood there, watching the baby like a man who had just uncovered the greatest secret in existence. She turned to him, her voice shaking. Did you know this would happen? His gaze flickered, just for a second, before he spoke. I suspected. Her breath caught in her throat. You suspected? You planned this? He exhaled slowly. Not like this. Her hands curled into fists. Then explain. He walked past her, stopping near the bassinet, staring down at the child as if he held the answer to a question humanity had never dared to ask. You already know about the genetic defect in my family, he said. But there's something I didn't tell you. She swallowed hard, waiting. For years, I searched for a cure. I went to every doctor, every specialist. Science had no answer. But then, I looked somewhere else. She frowned. Where? He turned back to her. History. The word sent a shiver down her spine. There were records, he continued, his voice eerily calm. Centuries ago, a child was born into my bloodline, one who was different. One who had power beyond what any human should have. Her pulse quickened. What kind of power? He hesitated. The ability to change things. Influence the world around him in ways that shouldn't have been possible. The flickering lights. The shifting air. The connection she felt every time she was near the baby. She took a shaky breath. And you think, our child is the same? His jaw tightened. I don't think. He turned back to the baby. I know. She felt the floor sway beneath her. That's why you chose me, isn't it? Her voice was barely a whisper. Not just because of my genetics. Not just to have an heir. His silence was answer enough. She took a step back, her mind reeling. This wasn't just about saving your family's legacy, she whispered. You were trying to bring back whatever was in your bloodline. His gaze remained fixed on the child. I was trying to find a miracle. Her stomach twisted. And what if this isn't a miracle, she asked, her voice breaking. What if this is something else? He finally turned to her. Then we have a choice to make. Her breath caught. What choice? His eyes darkened. Whether to control this power, or let it control us. The weight of his words pressed down on her like a crushing force. Control it, or let it control us. She stared at the baby, her baby, peacefully resting in the bassinet, unaware of the storm raging around him. He looked so innocent, so fragile, yet the moment she stepped closer, she could feel it again. The energy. The connection. Something beyond her understanding. Her breath came in shallow bursts. He's just a baby, she whispered. Not some experiment. Not a tool. The millionaire studied her carefully. He is more than you realize. She shook her head. He's my son. A tense silence filled the room. Then, the millionaire sighed. That's why you had to be the mother, he admitted. Because you would see him as something more than an anomaly. Her heart pounded. So, what now? His expression hardened. Now, we make a decision. She could feel it, the crossroads ahead. If the millionaire wanted, he could use his wealth, power, and influence to study the child, to shape him into whatever he believed he was meant to be. But at what cost? Would their son ever know a normal life? Would he be free? Or would he grow up as nothing more than a controlled experiment, locked away from the world? She met his gaze, and for the first time, she saw something unexpected. Not just calculation. Not just ambition. But doubt. Maybe, despite all his plans, he never truly expected this. Maybe, for the first time in his life, he was afraid of what he had created. She stepped between him and the bassinet. He's not your test subject, she said firmly. And I won't let you treat him like one. The millionaire exhaled slowly. You're willing to walk away? She swallowed hard. I will if I have to. Silence. Then, he did something she never expected. He nodded. Then take him, he said. Her breath hitched. What? You're right. His voice was quiet now, lacking its usual cold certainty. I was looking for a solution. For an answer. But I never expected. He trailed off, his gaze flickering toward the child. I never expected a miracle. She felt her throat tighten. So, what happens now? His lips pressed into a thin line. Now, you raise him. Protect him. His eyes darkened. And pray the world never learns what he is. Her chest tightened at the warning in his tone. What if they do? She whispered. The millionaire's face was unreadable. Then there won't be a place left in this world where he'll be safe. The finality in his words sent a chill through her. But when she looked back at the baby, peaceful and unaware, she made a silent vow. No matter what happened, no matter what the future held, she would keep him safe. Because in the end, the greatest miracles weren't born out of power or wealth. They were born out of love.